Welcome back to the Real Estate Rat Pack Radio Show with Chris, Joe, and Rob. The crew is taking your calls, so dial in at 1-800-808-5548.
And we are back. We're here with Jackie Bally and Samantha Merritt and mayoral candidate Bill King, and we're talking about Houston infrastructure. And this is a subject we could probably talk the next several days. And I understand that you're going to actually make that part of your show tomorrow, Jackie.
Yes, I just saw the topics our producers selected, and they want to talk about that controversial ruling.
Well, evidently it's
Shocker.
a big news. What? We don't even have a clue as what the impact of that decision is, do we?
No, we really don't. The only thing that I think is virtually certain is that the results of that election are going to be overturned, which means that we're not going to have the charter amendment that basically set out the structure of how this fund was supposed to work and how the money was supposed to be sent. The city is taking the position that it has the statutory authority under a different law to impose the drainage fee so that they can keep collecting the drainage fee even though that charter amendment goes away, which kind of begs the question, why did we have an election at all?
If they had that authority, it really is a puzzle. As I guess that way they said, well, we did put it out to the voters because I remember voting against it.
But where's that money going now?
It goes to a lot of things. Some of it's spent on infrastructure. They're also using it to basically balance the general fund budget. They're now paying for 550 people out of that fund, and some of those people are working on streets. A lot of them are not.
So, when you're talking about funds, I would like to talk about unfunded pensions, if you would like to talk a little bit about that.
I think he's the king of talking about it.
He is the king about it, and so I want to kind of get your take on that. Is what are we facing, and what type of liabilities are we looking at, and can we solve the problem?
Well, certainly we can solve it. Our pension plans were in pretty good shape as late as the year 2000. There are 3 defined benefit pension plans at the city, one for the police, one for the fire, and one for everybody else. And every year we have actuaries study the plans to determine whether or not the money we've set aside is sufficient to make all the payments on the benefits that have been earned through that date. So as late as 2000, the actuaries said we had set aside enough money to do that. But in 2001 and 2002, there were some very significant increases to the benefits, which dramatically increased the liabilities that we owed, and nobody put any money in to compensate for that. So we went from being fully funded in 2000 to the end of 2003. We owed the pension plans $2.5 billion.
I'm confused. We actually increased the benefits, but we didn't put any money aside to pay for those benefits. So how did that happen?
It seems we increased the force also, the police force. There was a huge addition there a few years ago.
Yeah. So it's the city agreed to it. It's been written into state law now, which is part of the problem. But this was a situation where you had people down there voting on this that didn't understand the implications. So, for example, before 2000, there wasn't a COLA in the pension plans. And so they said, oh, look, we give a 3% COLA. It's only 3% a year. What's the big deal? Well, when your assets are only earning maybe 8 or 9%, then suddenly you've taken away a third of the earning power of the assets. And so when you run that over a very long period of time, it has a very dramatic impact. And unfortunately, the people running the city at the time didn't understand that. Once you get behind on these plans, it becomes very difficult to ever catch up because you're not only having to pay what you owe, but what would have been earned on those assets. So essentially, you're financing this at like 8.5% interest. So we're now $4.5 billion behind on the plan.
So we're exponentially increasing it each year.
Right. And where the rubber really meets the road.
Compounding, yeah.
Now, where the rubber really meets the road on this is the amount of money you have to set aside to put into those plans, which goes up the more you owe. So in 2000, we were putting $100 million a year in. Last year, we were supposed to put in $400 million, which, by the way, was about 45% of all the property taxes that the city of Houston collected. By 2020, it will take more than half of the property taxes the city collects just to fund these plans. So this is not sustainable in the long run.
So basically, the rubber hit the road, but the road had a pothole in it. What I'm hearing.
That's well said.
Well, so tell me, you're in office day one, and what do we do to fix that?
Well, we have to come up with a plan that migrates us from defined benefit to defined contribution plans. This is what was done in private industry 20 or 30 years ago. Government's just, in its typical fashion, running well behind the curve. I'm not one that favors changing the benefits for existing employees because I think, a deal's a deal. We told them we were going to provide these benefits. They provided us their service. We can't give back the years they've given us. So I think we've got to honor those promises. But to continue to make these promises to new employees is just grossly irresponsible, and it will ultimately undermine not only the financial stability of the city, but also the plans themselves. This is a bad deal for the employees and for the taxpayers.
Yeah. Now, I understand that some of this can't be fixed unless we go to the state legislature to fix it. Well, tell me what that mechanics of that is.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a red herring issue, frankly. These laws,
I like those kind of issues.
Yeah, these laws have been written into, these pension plans have been written into state law, in large measure because the state doesn't trust city council to manage these things, and there's some argument for that, I guess. But when I go and talk to the leadership in Austin, they say, look, you come up here with a comprehensive plan to solve this problem, and we'll sit down and work something out. But that nobody from the city of Houston has come up here with any kind of a comprehensive plan. They'll come up with little fixes and so forth. But come up here with a broad coalition of Houstonians that say they want to change these plans, and we'll figure out something that works.
Well, I agree with you. I think once you make a deal, you make a deal, and just figure out how you're going to fund it. And it doesn't seem like we've got anybody or anything that's kind of heading that direction at all right now. In the last 5 years, we've got an additional $1 billion in debt to the pensions. Well, so everybody's been kicking the can down the road.
Correct.
Essentially, so if you get in as mayor, typically you're going to be there for 6 years. So I can kick that can long enough. So the next mayor's going to get somebody. Sooner or later the music's going to stop, and there's going to be a chair missing.
So tell me, why do you want this job? Okay, so let's switch, because you brought up something very interesting, something that we actually do in our city, Sugar Land, and in Fort Bend. We do have referendums. We do let the voters decide, and HISD, they are more prone to having referendums and bonds. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the latest round with that. I know this is not an HISD position, but the next mayor will be working with the largest school district. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the last HISD bond is an interesting case study to look at because I co-chaired that campaign with the tutors. And it was a $2 billion bond. It was the biggest school bond ever considered by the voters in the state of Texas. And it was basically to rebuild almost all the high schools inside the HISD. And it required a tax increase. And there was a lot of discussion about how to present that. And I said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the voters and taxpayers of HISD, and we're going to say we need more taxes to rebuild these high schools. I'm sorry, but they're in terrible shape. And if we don't do something about them, they're going to drag down the neighborhoods around them. I wouldn't send my kids to these schools. You wouldn't send your kids to these schools, and it's something that we as a community need to do. And you know what? 70% of the voters of HISD agreed with that, including, by the way, every Republican box in the city. Now, contrast that with the Rebuild Houston program, where we're scared to go to the voters and tell them that we need more money for infrastructure. I'll tell you, the voters will give you money for infrastructure if they're convinced that it's really going to be spent to fix these problems, and then if you're not wasting money on other things. But when the city's got $75 million a year in overtime, when we're running a crime lab, when the Harris County has the duplicate service and is dying to have our business, they're not going to give you more tax money.
Well, we had a flood about a week or so ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And, I'm talking to some people that have more information than I. We actually was part of that Brays Bayou, coming out of the banks. And I understand there's actually 7 lakes that are hooked to that system, but the Brays Bayou is not hooked to it yet. And we could have mitigated or eliminated that flood altogether. And so talk a little bit about why didn't we fund that piece?
Yeah, so you're talking about the Willow Waterhole
right.
reservoirs. Yeah, that's a great project, by the way. It not only has a lot of flood mitigation benefits, but it's also just going to be a beautiful. It's going to be an incredible. This is going to be Houston's new Central Park once it's all finished. It's going to be gorgeous. And there's some folks out there that are just doing an incredible job working on that project. It was not finished, and there could have been some overflow go into those lakes that would have mitigated the flooding to some degree. But I'll tell you the biggest problem in this particular flood, and by the way, Meyerland was the worst area, but there were probably a dozen areas around town, all the way down to Clear Lake and Kingwood, that flooded. This is
We got 12 inches in Sugar Land.
There were a lot of flooding problems around town because we're basically not doing any flood projects.
But we didn't flood because we have good infrastructure.
Yes, sir.
But I digress. Sorry.
Yes.
But Meyerland, that Brays Bayou is mostly flooded because there's a project called Project Brays that's going to redo the profile of Brays Bayou through that entire area. And there's about a mile and a half of that hadn't been finished because we haven't been able to get the federal funds to wrap it up. And I haven't seen a single person from the city up lobbying to get that money. I see them up lobbying for light rail money and all kinds of other things. But why aren't they up there, pounding the table about finishing that project so these people are not flooded anymore? My God, they've been flooded 2 or 3 times in the last 20 or 30 years. Enough's enough.
And they are up in arms. And, of course, there's talk about, the buybacks from FEMA and things like that in Meyerland and what's going to happen to Meyerland. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they tried to do that with Willow Bend, and that didn't work.
Well, but all the flood laws just changed. I mean, people's flood insurance is dramatically more expensive too. So, and that's one of the areas that it wasn't. Some of those neighborhoods weren't necessarily in a flood zone, but because of the way the infrastructure is set up, they're now completely flooded.
And when you talk about politics and real estate, this is exactly why it's so important to talk about. They are hand in hand because what the decisions that the city makes hugely impacts real estate.
Everything involves real estate.
Go look at the real estate values in Detroit.
Hey,
that was good.
I think you still buy one for $1 up there.
I think they're giving them away.
But they do have a really nice light rail system.
So, what?
Leave it to we have more industry, though. We've got our med center. We have more than just the automobile industry feeding Houston and making Houston thrive.
Yeah, well, our number one industry now is healthcare. And so we've kind of diversified from that, oil-based economy. Of course, if oil goes down, we are going to.
I think that's a little bit of hubris because I've gone back and read the newspaper stories about Detroit. By the way, in 1950, the population of Detroit was 1.9 million people. It was almost as big then as Houston is now. And you read the stories, and it was, there was no end to their prosperity and growth, and they were the new third coast there on the Great Lakes. But over many decades, they made a decision that they were not going to invest in infrastructure, that they were not going to put enough police officers on the street to make the city safe. They kept making unsustainable pension promises, not balancing the budget, and they started increasing taxes. They put in a drainage fee. Sound familiar?
All this.
They put in a garbage fee, which is currently being proposed. They put in a municipal income tax, and people said, you know what, I'm leaving. And the population went from 1.9 million down to 600,000 people.
Well, we're going to pick up there,
years.
but right now we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back.
Start to sprint.